The numbers of Irish people that fled Ireland during the Great Hunger is absolutely astronomical. Between 1845 and 1855, just 10 years, over 2 million people left the island. They went to North America, to Britain, and even as far away as Australia. If you walked down a street in New York, Boston, Liverpool or London, you were very likely to hear a conversation in Irish. Now, these people had left Ireland on what are known today as coffin ships. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you what that experience was like, where did that name Coffin Ships comes from, and exactly how many of these famine emigrants died trying to escape hunger at home. The history behind this is not necessarily what you might expect, and there's going to be a lot in this video that will surprise you. It was in 1846 that the Great Famine exodus from Ireland really began in earnest. In that year, the country entered its second year of starvation. It became clear the situation was absolutely calamitous. Hundreds of thousands of people would perish in that winter alone. But those who could afford to do so began to think that the best option they had was to leave Ireland. Now, most of them wanted to go to the US, but that did cost money. It would cost 40 to 50 shillings for a passage on a ship across the North Atlantic. So that meant that the poorest of the poor simply couldn't go. And in order to go to the US, it was a pretty long and arduous journey. It could take 8 weeks. And the first leg that we often forget about was actually just to get to the port alone, and this would add a lot of costs. So the first step of your journey would be to go from your home in Ireland to a port like maybe Cork, Dublin, Belfast, Waterford, somewhere like that, and from there you would actually board a ship across the Irish Sea usually to the port of Liverpool in England, and it was from Liverpool that all the North Atlantic ships went. So this leg of the journey cost not only the ticket to cross the Irish Sea, but you also had to buy food, and you'd often have to spend a night somewhere along the way. So this added considerable costs to the journey. Then when they arrived in Liverpool, they could actually find themselves trapped in that port for several weeks. So today, when we book a ticket, for example, we always think you just book a ticket on a specific day at a specific time and you turn up on that day. But in the 1840s, the cheapest tickets, which obviously most Irish famine emigrants would take, had to be basically, you couldn't book them in advance. So you'd turn up to a port and you'd wait around until a ship was full and then that ship would sail. But for a lot of people, this would mean they'd find themselves hanging around a port like Liverpool for a couple of weeks, and they had to buy food, they had to find somewhere to live for that couple of weeks, and this all added costs. Now, on top of this, something that's really important in terms of the story of coffin ships, the port of Liverpool, particularly into the year of 1847, was ravaged by disease as hundreds of thousands of Irish famine emigrants flooded into the port. So this time waiting around could actually be, in many ways, actually a death sentence, because I'm going to explain that now about where that name, coffin ships, comes from. So after spending time in Liverpool and you finally get onto a ship that's going to cross the North Atlantic, the ship would spend 4 to 6, maybe even 8 weeks at sea, depending on the weather, and then you would arrive in a North American port. Now, I use the term North American because in late 1846 and into 1847, most Irish people didn't actually go directly to the United States, but instead they would board ships that would take them to Canada, because the Canadian route was actually cheaper in 1846 and 1847. That was because there was less regulation on it. And this is actually where the term coffin ship really comes from. The situation on the boats going across the North Atlantic to Canada were absolutely unbelievable. So the ships themselves were often not that well suited to carrying passengers. In some cases, they were freight ships that would add in decks for people after they carry freight across the North Atlantic to Europe. And then on the return leg, they'll bring back passengers. So they're not that well suited to having people on board. On top of that, in 1847 in particular, a lot of people getting onto these ships are already sick. And if you go out on a ship into the North Atlantic with typhus, not only are you condemning yourself to a likely death, but that typhus is going to spread through the ship and kill huge numbers of people. Now, in 1847, there are some absolutely awful cases. For example, in a case that's very well known where the Mahon landlords in Roscommon chartered 3 ships to take their tenants to North America. Nearly half of all those people either died en route across the Atlantic or in quarantine stations on the St. Lawrence River. Now, recently there's been detailed analysis of these ships in 1847, and the previous figure, it was once thought that 1 in 5 of all these famine emigrants died. But if we take all the ships, and the most recent analysis in a book called The Coffin Ship by Dr. Cian McMahon, he estimates that it was probably closer to 10%. So 1 in 10 of all famine emigrants in that year of 1847 die. The situation is so bad that a Catholic bishop in Canada, Joseph Signet, will write a letter to Irish newspapers that's published in numerous Irish newspapers, warning Irish people not to take this cheaper route to Canada. Now, this situation will change in 1848, and I'm going to look at what changes in that year and what life was like on the ships that went directly to the US. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this content, please do subscribe to the channel. I release 2 videos on Irish history every week, and we're building a really great community here. We've over 40,000 followers, and we're closing in on 50,000 followers. So do become part of this community. Subscribe to the channel and get the next video when it comes out. But now to continue the story into 1848. So after the horrors of 1847 and huge warnings were put out appealing to Irish people not to take that cheaper route, increasing numbers of people crossed directly to New York, and this route was better regulated. A lot of the shipping companies had to take basically responsibility for their passengers, and if they arrived in New York and had broke regulations, the US government would force them to bear the costs of this. And you see huge numbers of Irish people continuing to emigrate, but then they flood into the US ports of New York and Boston and places like that. But the survival rate among those people is actually much, much lower. So for example, Cian McMahon in his research would estimate that about only 1 to 2% of Irish people crossing the Atlantic in the later 1840s, so that's 1848 and 1849 and into the early 1850s, but you're looking at a death rate then of about 1 to 2%. Now that might seem really high today, but actually in the 1840s, it's hard to imagine, but a death rate of 1 to 2% on transatlantic ships of any kind was pretty standard for the time. So that death rate of 1 to 2% is more normal as the situation for famine emigrants is improved. Now, a lot of them will find themselves in New York in absolutely desperate situations. I'm going to look at that in a separate video about what life is like when they arrive. But just to finish off this video, I want to look at some of the complexities of life on board the ships as they crossed the Atlantic, and maybe why they were remembered as coffin ships, because it's not just because of the death rates. Sometimes the conditions on board could be appalling. So when famine emigrants boarded ships in Irish ports, or obviously in the port of Liverpool where most of them left from, they would have to bring their own food with them for the journey. Now that journey could last anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks depending on the weather, and in many cases either the food rotted or ran out. And this led to very difficult situations where people were really hungry on that voyage across. And you can imagine how it might be remembered in terrible situations. On top of that, I've already talked about how in 1847, there was the risk of disease on the ships. And then in 1849, there was a new risk when cholera broke out. So people had very difficult experiences. On top of that, Cian McMahon, that historian I mentioned earlier, in his book, The Coffin Ship, he talks about how people at sea were at the whims of a captain and the crew, and basically if the captain and crew were violent or would mistreat them, there was not a lot that people could do. So many people had really difficult experiences on board those ships, and I actually have a full podcast-length interview with Dr. Cian McMahon. I'm going to link that beneath this video if you want to find out more, where he shares the reality of life on board these ships, because it was very different than we often imagine. But over the course of the late 1840s and into the 1850s, those staggering numbers of over 2 million people left Ireland. Now, about 1.8 million of them would reach the United States. The rest would have been in Britain. So you get people who go to Liverpool maybe hoping to emigrate to the US, but can never leave and are essentially trapped in places like Liverpool and London. And then you get smaller numbers who went all the way to Australia. Some of them actually were on British convict ships, and actually they were some of the safest ships you could travel on. Even though the voyage to Australia was way longer, the British Navy took control of those ships and they had surgeons on board the ships, and that made the journey a lot safer than the private ships that crossed the Atlantic, which would have no doctors on board. Now, I hope that gives you a sense of the history of coffin ships and how they're pretty different maybe than we often imagine. The death rates that were previously once talked about of 20 to 30% are not true across the board. They do soar in individual cases in 1847 when the situation is really desperate, when disease breaks out on these ships and the ships themselves are not that well suited to it. But after 1847, as you move into 1848 and 1849, while the conditions could still be awful, the death rate does fall back to 1 to 2%. Finally, I will say thanks for your time, and if you enjoyed this video, please do think about subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate it.